Something extraordinary is happening in the Persian Gulf right now, and the implications are staggering. We're witnessing what may be the most significant military standoff between Iran and the United States in years, one that's unfolding not through dramatic headlines, but through calculated moves and countermoves that reveal the true balance of power in the Middle East. The deployment of B-2 stealth bombers alongside the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group wasn't merely routine posturing. It represented a clear message of American intent. But here's what makes this moment absolutely critical. Iran hasn't backed down. Instead, Tehran has responded with its own demonstration of capability, directly challenging what many assumed was untouchable American air superiority. This isn't about bravado or empty threats. This is about fundamental shifts in regional power dynamics that will reshape everything from oil markets to alliance structures across the globe. The question we must ask ourselves today isn't whether this confrontation matters, but rather what it tells us about the rapidly changing nature of deterrence, technological parity, and the willingness of regional powers to openly contest American military dominance in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Now, to understand what's really happening here, we need to step back and look at the broader picture, because this confrontation didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's the culmination of months, indeed years, of escalating tensions that have been building beneath the surface of what many in the mainstream media have chosen to largely ignore or mischaracterize. The United States has maintained a significant naval presence in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters for decades. This isn't new. What is new, however, is the context in which this presence now operates and the nature of the challenges it faces. Let's begin with the deployment itself. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber is one of the most sophisticated and expensive military assets in the American arsenal. Each aircraft costs approximately $2 billion, and the United States operates only 20 of them. When Washington decides to deploy these particular aircraft to a region, it's sending a very specific signal. These are not your conventional bombers. These are platforms designed to penetrate the most advanced air defense systems in the world, to strike targets that other aircraft simply cannot reach, and to do so with virtual impunity. The message is unmistakable. We can reach anything we choose to reach, anywhere, at any time, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. That's the theory, at least. That's what decades of American military doctrine has been built upon. But here's where things become truly interesting. Iran has developed over the past 15 to 20 years one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in the Middle East. We're not talking about outdated Soviet-era systems here, though some of those certainly remain in the inventory. We're talking about indigenously developed radars, domestically produced surface-to-air missile systems, and perhaps most significantly, Iranian versions of Russian S-300 systems and technology that Tehran has managed to acquire despite sanctions and international pressure. Now, whether these systems can actually detect and engage a B-2 bomber is a matter of considerable debate among military analysts. The United States certainly doesn't believe they can, or at least that's the public position. But Iran has made very public claims about its ability to track stealth aircraft, and more importantly, they've invested enormous resources into developing counter-stealth radar technologies. What we're seeing now is Iran effectively calling America's bluff. They're saying, we see your bombers, we're tracking your carrier, and we're not intimidated. More than that, they're demonstrating their own capabilities in ways that are designed to send a counter message not just to Washington, but to the entire region and indeed to the world. France has conducted military exercises that specifically simulate responses to American airstrikes. They've showcased what they claim are advanced missile systems capable of targeting naval vessels at considerable distances. They've demonstrated drone swarms, underground missile facilities, and a whole array of asymmetric capabilities that don't try to match American power, dollar for dollar or platform for platform, but instead seek to exploit perceived vulnerabilities in the American approach. Now, let's talk about the USS Abraham Lincoln, because this carrier strike group is absolutely central to understanding the current situation. An American aircraft carrier is not just a ship. It's a floating city, a complete military ecosystem that projects power across thousands of miles of ocean. The Abraham Lincoln carries approximately 90 aircraft, has a crew of over 5,000 personnel, and is accompanied by guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. This is the very definition of overwhelming force. For decades, the presence of an American carrier in a region has been enough to fundamentally alter the strategic calculations of every nation within range. But here's the crucial question we must ask ourselves. Does that still hold true in 2025? Iran has made very specific threats regarding American naval assets in the Persian Gulf. These aren't empty boasts from minor officials. Senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have stated explicitly that they possess the means to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, and to inflict catastrophic damage on any naval vessels that attempt to operate in these waters during a conflict. Now, many Western analysts have dismissed these claims as propaganda, as bluster designed for domestic consumption, but we need to look very carefully at what Iran has actually demonstrated in recent years, not what they claim, but what they've proven. In 2019, Iranian forces seized a British-flagged tanker in the Strait of Hormuz using small, fast attack craft and helicopters. They did this despite the presence of Royal Navy vessels in the area. They executed the operation with precision and faced no immediate military consequences. That same year, facilities in Saudi Arabia were struck by drones and cruise missiles in an attack that, regardless of who ultimately carried it out, demonstrated the vulnerability of even heavily defended targets to relatively inexpensive unmanned systems. The Saudis, armed with American Patriot missile batteries and some of the most advanced air defense systems money can buy, failed to intercept these weapons. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are documented events that fundamentally challenge conventional assumptions about military power in the region. Now, let's consider the strategic calculus from Iran's perspective, because this is absolutely essential to understanding why they're willing to challenge American military assets in ways that might seem suicidal to outside observers. Tehran looks at the past 2 decades of American military interventions in the Middle East and draws very specific conclusions. They saw what happened in Iraq, where the initial invasion was certainly successful in toppling Saddam Hussein's government, but where the subsequent occupation turned into a grinding, expensive stalemate that ultimately forced American withdrawal. They watched what happened in Afghanistan, where the world's most powerful military fought for 20 years and ultimately departed with the Taliban returning to power. They observed the intervention in Libya, which succeeded in overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, but left the country in chaos. And most significantly, from Iran's perspective, they've seen how American threats against their own nuclear program have been made repeatedly over the years, but never actually executed. This creates what we might call a credibility problem for American deterrence. Washington can deploy all the B-2 bombers and aircraft carriers it wants, but if the other side doesn't believe you're actually willing to use them, then their deterrent value diminishes considerably. Iran has calculated, it appears, that the United States is not willing to engage in a full-scale war with a country of 85 million people that has been preparing for exactly such a conflict for decades. They believe, perhaps correctly, that the American public has no appetite for another major Middle Eastern war, that the economic consequences would be catastrophic, and that the military outcome would be far from certain, regardless of the overwhelming technological superiority the United States possesses on paper. And here we come to one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire situation, which is the question of asymmetric warfare and how it fundamentally changes the nature of military confrontation. The United States military is designed to fight and win conventional wars against peer or near-peer adversaries. It's structured around high-technology platforms, networked systems, air superiority, and the ability to project power globally. This is extraordinarily effective against certain types of opponents and in certain types of conflicts, but it's also extraordinarily expensive, and more importantly, it creates dependencies and vulnerabilities that can be exploited by adversaries who think differently about warfare. Iran doesn't need to sink an American aircraft carrier to win a conflict in the Persian Gulf. They simply need to make operating that carrier so dangerous and so costly that the United States decides the strategic objective isn't worth the risk. They can do this through mines, through swarms of small, fast attack craft carrying anti-ship missiles, through submarine warfare, through long-range ballistic missiles, and through attacks on the regional bases and facilities that American forces depend upon for logistics and support. This is the essence of asymmetric strategy, and it's something that Iran has studied intensively, learning lessons from Hezbollah's performance against Israel in 2006, from various insurgent groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, and from their own historical experience during the Iran-Iraq War. But let's talk about what's happening right now, today, because the immediate situation is what concerns us most. Reports indicate that Iranian naval forces have increased their activities in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian aircraft have reportedly conducted more frequent patrols along the coast. Ground-based radar systems are operating at heightened states of readiness. These are all indicators that Tehran is not simply watching passively as American forces operate in what they consider their strategic backyard. They're actively preparing for potential confrontation, demonstrating their presence, and ensuring that Washington understands that any military action would come at a very significant cost. Now, from the American perspective, this is deeply frustrating because it challenges the fundamental assumption that has guided American Middle East policy for generations, which is that overwhelming military superiority translates directly into political leverage. The United States expects that when it deploys assets like the B-2 bomber and the Abraham Lincoln, other nations will adjust their behavior accordingly, will become more cautious, more accommodating, more willing to negotiate on American terms. But what we're seeing with Iran is exactly the opposite reaction. Instead of backing down, Tehran is doubling down, increasing its own military activities, making more aggressive statements, and essentially telling Washington that intimidation will not work. This brings us to the broader geopolitical context, which is absolutely crucial for understanding why this confrontation is happening now and what it might mean for the future. The United States is increasingly focused on what it calls great power competition with China and, to a lesser extent, Russia. American military planners are deeply concerned about the possibility of conflict in the Pacific over Taiwan, about Russian actions in Eastern Europe, about maintaining technological superiority in areas like hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, and space-based systems. The Middle East, from this strategic perspective, is supposed to be a problem that's already been solved, or at least managed to the point where it doesn't require the level of attention and resources that it consumed during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. But Iran refuses to play along with this script. Tehran has its own strategic objectives, its own regional ambitions, and its own timeline for achieving them. The Iranians look at the current international situation and see opportunities, not threats. They see an America that's increasingly distracted, increasingly divided domestically, and increasingly unwilling to engage in extended military commitments abroad. They see opportunities to expand their influence through proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and potentially other locations. They see the possibility of breaking free from the sanctions regime that has constrained their economy for years, and most importantly, they see a chance to fundamentally alter the regional balance of power in ways that would have been impossible a decade or two ago. The nuclear dimension of this confrontation cannot be ignored, even though it often operates in the background of these more immediate military posturing exercises. Iran's nuclear program remains a central point of contention between Tehran and Washington. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement signed in 2015, has been effectively dead since the United States withdrew in 2018. Since that withdrawal, Iran has steadily expanded its nuclear activities, enriching uranium to higher levels, installing more advanced centrifuges, and reducing cooperation with international inspectors. Western intelligence estimates vary on exactly how long it would take Iran to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon if they made the decision to do so. But most analysts believe we're talking about weeks or months, not years. This creates an incredibly volatile situation because it means that any military confrontation between the United States and Iran carries with it the potential for rapid escalation, not just in conventional terms, but potentially into the nuclear realm. American policymakers have repeatedly stated that they will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. Iranian officials have insisted that they have no intention of building such weapons, but that they will not accept constraints on their peaceful nuclear program that aren't applied equally to other nations. These are fundamentally incompatible positions, and the presence of American military assets in the region serves as a constant reminder that Washington retains the option of military action to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition. Now, let's consider the economic dimensions of this crisis because they're absolutely central to understanding what's at stake. The Persian Gulf region contains approximately half of the world's proven oil reserves. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is one of the most strategically important choke points on the planet. Any serious disruption to the flow of oil through this strait would send global energy prices skyrocketing, would trigger economic crisis in countries around the world, and would fundamentally destabilize the international financial system. Iran knows this, the United States knows this, and everyone else knows this. It's both Iran's greatest strategic asset and potentially its greatest vulnerability. If Iran actually attempted to close the Strait of Hormuz during a conflict, they would be inviting massive international intervention, not just from the United States, but from every country that depends on Gulf oil, which is essentially the entire global economy. But the threat of closure, the possibility of disruption, the risk premium that this adds to oil prices, these are tools that Tehran can use without actually pulling the trigger. Every time tensions escalate, every time there's a confrontation between Iranian and American forces, oil prices react, insurance rates for tankers increase, shipping companies become more cautious. This economic leverage gives Iran a form of power that doesn't depend on matching American military capabilities, ship for ship or plane for plane. From Washington's perspective, this economic vulnerability is deeply problematic because it means that even a limited conflict with Iran could have global economic consequences far exceeding the immediate military situation. American policymakers have to consider not just whether they can win a military confrontation with Iran, which they almost certainly could in conventional terms, but whether they can do so without triggering an economic crisis that would undermine American interests far more significantly than any potential benefit gained from military action. This is the essence of strategic complexity in the modern world, where military power and economic interdependence create constraints that didn't exist in earlier eras. The role of regional actors in this confrontation is also absolutely essential to understand. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and other countries in the region have their own interests and their own perspectives on the Iran question. Some of these countries would very much like to see the United States take military action against Iran to permanently degrade Iranian capabilities and reduce Iranian regional influence. Others have become more cautious in recent years, recognizing that any conflict would affect them directly and potentially catastrophically. We've seen a remarkable shift in recent years, with several Arab states normalizing relations with Israel, partly in response to the shared perception of Iran as a threat. but we've also seen attempts at dialogue and de-escalation between Iran and some of its regional rivals, suggesting that not everyone in the neighborhood wants to see this situation spiral into open warfare. What we're witnessing right now with the B-2 bombers and the Abraham Lincoln is a test, a probe, a moment where both sides are measuring the other's resolve and capabilities. The United States is demonstrating that it retains the ability and the will to project power into the region, that it will not be intimidated by Iranian threats, that it's prepared to defend its interests and those of its allies. Iran is demonstrating that it will not be cowed by American military displays, that it possesses capabilities that make any attack costly and risky, and that it's prepared to escalate if pushed. Both sides are communicating, but they're doing so through military deployments and demonstrations rather than diplomatic channels, which is always a dangerous way to conduct international relations. The question that hangs over all of this is simple but profound. What happens next? Does this escalate into actual military confrontation, or do both sides eventually step back from the brink? History teaches us that these situations can go either way, that accidents happen, that miscalculations occur, that pride and domestic political pressures can push leaders into conflicts they didn't originally intend. But history also teaches us that nuclear-armed or near-nuclear-armed states tend to be very cautious about direct military confrontation with other major powers, precisely because the risks are so enormous. We're in a moment of tremendous uncertainty, watching a slow-motion crisis unfold that could shape the Middle East and indeed the entire global strategic landscape for years or even decades to come. And that's why this confrontation between Iran and American military assets matters so much more than just another headline about tensions in the Gulf.